continuing on with our brain anatomy, it's time to look at the cerebral hemispheres. Now, the cerebral hemispheres are pretty much the whole top portion of the brain. In all, it's about 82% of the mass of the brain. So you can see it's actually a majority of your brain. So these cerebral hemispheres, you're going to have a right and a left, so two halves of the brain. And they have three main regions. You have the cortex, you have the white matter, and then you have the basal nuclei. Together, those all become your cerebral hemispheres. Now, these hemispheres are what allow you to have your thought processes. It's kind of traditionally what you think of when you think of your brain. You're going to have motor areas, sensory areas, and these association areas. Now, like the name implies, motor areas are motor output. They're controlling the movements that you're having. While the sensory areas, like the name implies, is sensory input. It's helping to bring in and then process what's going on. But these association areas, it's helping to kind of integrate different bits of information. And we'll get more into these later. But it's really trying to bring pieces together and to create the full picture for you. So motor, sensory, and association areas, all different parts of the brain. Now, one thing to keep in mind, we might be talking about parts and pieces here, but everything works together. The motor works the sensory because you can't have the motor movements without the sensory feedback about what's happening. Sometimes you can't get the sensory input without the motor moving you to an area to get the sensory. So a lot of times everything really is working together. So the term sulci. Now the term sulci is going to be a shallow indent. So you can see the sulci here is this little indent. That's a sulci or a sulcus. So it's shallow groove. I'm saying shallow because there are deep grooves also, and they're called something different. So sulci are these little indents, these little grooves in the brain. An important one to look at is the central sulcus. Now, the central sulcus is separating the frontal and parietal lobes. You can kind of see it right there. That's the central sulcus, separating the frontal and parietal lobes. You then have gyri. Now, gyri or gyrus, that's going to be the upfolds. So these kind of ridges or these upfolds on the brain. You have the precentral gyrus. Now, the precentral gyrus is this area kind of right there. That's the precentral gyrus. Pre being in front of, so in front of the central sulcus. You also have the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral is right here. That's the postcentral gyrus. Post being after. Now, those will become important when we get to them a little later. So keep in mind the precentral gyrus, central sulcus, postcentral gyrus. Now going to a deep indent, it's referred to as a fissure. So the sulcus was the shallow. This deep, as you can see right here, that deep is a fissure. Goes much further down into the brain, a fissure. You have the longitudinal fissure. Now, the longitudinal fissure is this piece coming right in the middle here. It's what separates the right and left hemispheres. So if you're looking at an actual brain, you might think it's together, but in between, that actually goes down quite a bit. That's going to be this longitudinal fissure. You have the transverse fissure. Now, transverse fissure is this part back here. It's what separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The transverse fissure, cerebrum and cerebellum. All right, so lobes. Hopefully you can think back and remember the actual bones of the skull because the lobes of the brain pretty much match up. You have your frontal lobe. So this is your frontal lobe up here. It's in the front, same place the frontal bone is, the frontal lobe. It's dealing with voluntary motor functions. It's one of the main aspects here. So when you're moving an arm, moving a hand, walking, when you're thinking about what you're doing, that's voluntary motor control. That's your frontal lobe. You have motivation and planning. So you're planning out a vacation or you're planning out what to do for the day. Think about that as your frontal lobe. Memory, mood, emotion are all planted in here. So now this is not the only place for memory, and especially not the only place for mood, but it's all being done in the frontal lobe, so it's part of it. Social judgment, aggression. Well, social judgment is if you're out in public and should you do this or should you not do this? That's social judgment. What is the correct thing to do in a social setting? Social judgment. And aggression, I think, is self-explanatory there. Aggression, acting out there. And this is also why when you start thinking about adolescents as they're aging, growing up, this frontal lobe doesn't fully develop into mid-20s usually. So it can be 23, 24, 25 sometimes until the frontal lobe is fully developed, which means there might be misplaced aggression, misplaced social judgments are all happening in this case. So as the frontal lobe and all the rest of the brain keeps developing, it's learning more and more about these. The parietal lobe, same place the bone was. This is your parietal lobe. Now the parietal lobe, sensory reception and integration. The reason those are two different things, sensory reception is simply bringing the information in. The integration part of it is put together to understand it, to know what it is, know what you're hearing or seeing or feeling. So you have both bringing the sensory information in and then integration of it. Temporal lobe, same thing on the side. That's your temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is going to be primarily sound and smell. So mostly sound and smell in the temporal lobe. Think of a hole in the nose in the front. Yes, but those receptors travel back to the temporal lobe. And the occipital lobe, which is what's back here. That's the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is primarily vision. And if you really think, hold on, the eyes are the front of this head. Yes, but those optic nerves run all the way back to the occipital lobe. So that's why if you ever get hit in the back of the head, for example, you might start to see colors or stars, because that's your visual center, all the way to the very back of your skull in the occipital lobe. And then there's this insula lobe. It's the one that's kind of deeper down here. If you take the temporal lobe and kind of pull it back, that's the insula lobe. We're not really getting into functions or anything, you're just going to know it's down there. So frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, insula lobe. So a little bit about the different lobes and some basic structures of your cerebrum.